The Legend of Zelda has always been a melting pot of ideas. Since the series' debut, the developers have drawn from their own lives and interests to create something truly magical and unique, yet something which also represents a giant blend of culture, religion, stories, and art. And it goes without saying that, as with any contemporary fantasy, Zelda draws heavily on the works of the grandfather of the genre, J.R.R. Tolkien. Claiming that a work of fantasy was inspired by Lord of the Rings is kind of redundant. Of course it was. In the words of Terry Pratchett, J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close, sometimes it's a shape on the horizon, sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist has either made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. Zelda is a high fantasy action-adventure series where a young boy, armed only with his sword and his courage, saves his world from evil, a dark lord who wants to use a magical golden artifact to dominate and rule. It's inspired by Lord of the Rings, but it's deeper than surface level. Zelda's connections to the Lord of the Rings go all the way back to the development of the original game, back in the 1980s, whose story was directly inspired by the books. And Tolkien's ideas run through the games right up until the present day, like blood in their veins. If one can't see the influence, it is because these games stand firmly on Mount Fuji. Let's examine why. First, a huge thank you to Raycon, this video's sponsor. Last month, Raycon sent me a pair of their everyday earbuds. I first used them as my travel option when I'm not at home, thanks to their tiny profile when tucked away in their colourful protective case, but I've ended up wearing them a lot around the house too. The everyday earbuds boast multi-point connectivity, so you can link them to multiple devices at once, such as to your phone and to your Nintendo Switch. And, of course, it's a crime to play any Zelda game without the best sound quality. I've had problems in the past with other earbuds not quite sitting right in my ears, either falling out if I move around too much, or just becoming uncomfortable after prolonged use. But these Raycon everyday earbuds genuinely are incredibly comfortable, with optimized gel tips for a snug fit. If you're wanting a pair in time for Christmas, make sure you head over to buyraycon.com/ZelticYT before the 15th of December to grab up to 25% off site-wide. And if you're not completely happy with them, it's no problem. Raycon offers a 30-day happiness guarantee and easy returns policy. The original Legend of Zelda game was published in 1986, famously created by the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto, as a way to provide players with the same sense of adventure and discovery he once felt exploring the countryside around his house. But it was Takashi Tezuka who wrote the story. In fact, it was he who wrote the story for both Zelda 1 and Zelda 2: Adventure of Link. The 1996 issue of the Club Nintendo magazine describes the process for creating The Legend of Zelda. Translated from German, it reads, "Mid-80s came around, and the worldwide triumph of the NES began with Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Many similar games followed until The Legend of Zelda appeared and created a completely new genre." Responsible for the game were the two program designers Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, who had set the goal of developing a fairy tale adventure game with action elements. The term action-adventure was born. Takashi Tezuka, an immense lover of fantasy novels such as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, wrote the script for the first two games in the Zelda series. Further cementing this connection between Zelda's roots and the works of Tolkien is an interview from Super Play magazine from 2003, where an interviewer asked Miyamoto, "Apparently the Tale of Hyrule was created by Kensuke Tanabe, and he was very inspired by Tolkien's books. how much of the original manuscript was written by him, and what were your ideas? Miyamoto corrects the interviewer. No, all ideas for The Legend of Zelda were mine and Takashi Tezuka's, and claims that the main influences were books, movies, and our own lives. So between these two interviews, we can get a pretty solid idea of just how big an influence The Lord of the Rings was on The Legend of Zelda, at least in the beginning. And with this in mind, elements of the game's world and story begin to stand out. A golden artifact coveted by the Dark Lord, which is used to defeat him by a hero who sets out on a journey across a fantasy world, armed with nothing but a sword and his courage. Link's goal, like Frodo's, is to bring a golden artifact to a fiery mountain. Ganon's lair in the original game is of course inside Death Mountain, similar to Tolkien's Mount Doom, the volcanic peak in Mordor in which the Dark Lord Sauron first forged his One Ring, and the only place it can be destroyed. But the deeper themes of Middle-earth are present here too. The Lord of the Rings is a story about the end of magic. The War of the Ring is one final, climactic struggle against evil before the world moves on. Middle-earth is a vast, mighty land, but it lies in the shadow of what came before it. Throughout the Fellowship's journey alone, the reader encounters the crumbling ruins of the Watchtower of Amon-Sul, the Kingdom of Moria, and the broken stonework of Amon-Hen. But this feeling is highlighted most by the fact that the elves, enlightened beings who represent the magic of the world, are leaving, sailing west into the undying lands, never to return. Tolkien's fantasy is set in a world of decline, and the first two Zelda games, both with their world and story written by Tezuka, feel almost post-apocalyptic. Hyrule is in a state of decay, a shadow of a former strength we don't get to explore until the third game in the series, A Link to the Past. Zelda 1's Hyrule is devoid of any towns, and the only people who aren't monsters hide in caves. Zelda 2 expands the world beyond its borders, with the first game's Hyrule serving as only the most southwestern part of a larger world, but one that is the scattered remains of a once prosperous kingdom. This setting of a world in decline has been seen time and time again in the series, such as the Wind Waker taking place after the Great Flood, but most prominently in Breath of the Wild, the game designed as a spiritual remake of the first. Here, Hyrule clings to life a century after a cataclysm. The age of kings and magic and heroes has gone, save for Link, the last light, when all other lights go out. Tolkien's works may have also inspired the decision to make Zelda a Christian story. Later games in the series lean much more heavily on Japanese religion, but the early games were explicitly Christian. Link's shield is marked with a cross, as is his Book of Magic, which in Japanese is just called Bible. Adventure of Link features the cross, a holy item which can allow Link to see previously invisible demons. And there's even artwork of Link praying before a statue of Jesus on the cross. And yes, this is official. The decision to write early Zelda lore as a more Western, Christian narrative could have been tied to Tezuka's passion for Western fantasy novels, like the works of Tolkien. Of his own work, Tolkien wrote that The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. Of course, it would be disingenuous to credit Tolkien as the source of all of Tezuka's ideas for the first two Zelda games. Like Miyamoto said, the pair were inspired by many things: religion, folklore, manga, movies, or childhood adventures of the developers. Many of these concepts could have come from other sources too, either in part or in their entirety, but for this video I'm specifically focusing on elements that could have been directly drawn from The Lord of the Rings, given what we know about the role the books played in the series' foundations. Inspiration from Tolkien can also be seen in the Zelda series' defining entry, Ocarina of Time. The game finds Link, a young boy, living in the sheltered paradise of the Kokiri Forest, mirroring Frodo's home in the idyllic Shire. But when an ancient grandfatherly figure in the Great Deku Tree and Gandalf informs the hero of the danger threatening the wider world, they set out into the unknown, leaving comfort and innocence behind in the pursuit of a great quest that will forever change them. The similarities between the Kokiri Forest and the Shire are numerous. In fact, the Deku scrubs that are found all across Hyrule were originally all one character, called Hobbit, who would have told Link stories and sold him items. This character was removed, and individual Deku scrubs took its place. It could be argued that Hyrule's other races also mirror those found in Middle-earth, such as the enlightened, aloof Zora and elves, and the tough, mountain-dwelling Gorons and dwarves. But The Lord of the Rings' greatest influence on the Zelda series came not from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien himself, but from a man called Peter Jackson. The early 2000s saw the release of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, and with them, a cultural phenomenon was born. These weren't just adaptations of the most popular fantasy books ever, they were some of the best films ever made, bringing Middle-earth to the screen in exquisite detail, transforming Tolkien's works into blockbuster, epic fantasy movies. To say the Lord of the Rings films were popular would be an understatement, and like how the books had influenced the story and setting of the very first Zelda game, Middle-earth would once again heavily impact the series. Because while this series of huge-scale fantasy films were drawing the world's attention, Nintendo were receiving criticism for their latest Zelda game, The Wind Waker. Now, The Wind Waker is my all-time favourite video game, and it has more than its fair share of rich story and themes. And now, over 20 years after its release, it's remembered as one of the greatest entries in the Zelda series, a masterfully crafted blend of gameplay and story. But at the time, this wasn't the general consensus. Zelda fans wanted something more like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, something which scratched that itch for darker, more epic fantasy. And while The Wind Waker does have deep, mature themes below its surface, its cel-shaded art style and cartoonish atmosphere meant that, to many fans, this wasn't it. So, Nintendo gave it to them. In a direct response to the popularity of Jackson's films, and to the backlash surrounding The Wind Waker's graphics, existing development for the game's sequel was turned around. The decision was made to deliberately heighten the scale and grit, and Twilight Princess was born. Art director Satoru Takezawa mentioned, in a quote found in Art and Artifacts, that the proposed setting for The Wind Waker 2 was not on the sea, but on land. The desire to depict Toon Link on a horse riding around the Great Plains was great. However, with his small stature and short arms and legs, it would have been too difficult to make him look good on a horse. It wasn't like we could just create an adult version of Toon Link. And that was about the time that we heard people were wanting a realistic-looking Zelda game again. Also at the time, there was an epic fantasy movie which was very popular. So, after re-examining the situation, we said to ourselves, let's do this thing. And in an Iwata Asks segment from 2006, director Eiji Aonuma said that, "Now that we've finished, I feel with a generation accustomed to watching epic films like The Lord of the Rings, when you want to design a convincing world, that sort of vast scale becomes necessary." And Twilight Princess's connections to the Lord of the Rings films are obvious. The game feels much more serious and intense than its predecessors, features epic horseback battles, a fight against a corrupted Goron which is very reminiscent of the Balrog, and a master-puppet relationship between the game's primary and secondary antagonists in Ganondorf and Zant, from which similarities can be drawn to Sauron and Saruman, or perhaps to the Witch King of Angmar. To this day, the game represents the Zelda series' most explicit foray into the genre of traditional, Western epic fantasy, and it's definitely a setting I'd love to see the series return to in the future. While Tolkien's impact can be felt in all subsequent works of fantasy, it is interesting how the story of The Lord of the Rings heavily influenced the Zelda series not once, but twice, not just with the books, but the films too. Since the days of Tezuka writing game manuals, a lot has changed. Zelda has grown into its own, drawing influence from all kinds of places to add to its own unique charm and identity, becoming almost incalculably influential in its own right. Just as all fantasy takes from Tolkien, all adventure games take from Zelda, whether consciously or subconsciously, intentionally or otherwise. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already for more Zelda content. Another huge thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. You can grab your own pair of everyday earbuds at buyraycon.com/ZelticYT. Cheers guys, and I'll see you next time.